Welcome to Intersect, where church meets culture. My name is Josh Desch, and I'm the lead pastor at Northeast Presbyterian Church in lovely Columbia, South Carolina. And I am joined, as always, by my wife, my co-host, the thrifty Betsy.
Thrifty, thank you.
Thrifty. You know why I'm saying thrifty, Bets? Because the other day you came home and you said, Josh, you will not believe the find that I had at Goodwill today.
Yes.
You found two barely worn pair of Clark's Wallabies.
Yes.
Amazing.
At Goodwill for $6.50 each.
$6.50 each, and you're planning on selling those for a hefty profit.
Well, we hope. It would be nice. They are great shoes.
That's some Proverbs 31 stuff right there. That's
some of the most comfortable shoes, I think.
Yeah, if they were your size, you might be keeping those.
I probably would.
Awesome. Well, Bets, we are so excited about the conversation that we're going to have today. It's a book review, and here's the title: The Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. That book is by Sarah McCammon. Mm-hmm. Many of you know that name if you're familiar at all with NPR. We don't listen to a lot of NPR, but we know that name.
Yep.
And Bets, Vanna, you're holding up the book.
Yes. So it is a great book. Sarah McCammon as you said, she works for NPR. She is a national political correspondent for NPR. She's the host of the NPR Politics podcast, which I've listened to here and there, especially in election years where there's more to talk about. And during the 2016 election cycle, Sarah was NPR's lead political reporter assigned to the Donald Trump campaign. So I'm sure she saw a lot of lively stuff when covering that campaign.
And Bets, I'm sure she did. This book came out in 2024.
Yes, brand new.
Brand new book. Mm-hmm. And I think for many of our listeners and viewers watching on our YouTube channel here, they would say even this word, Exvangelical, is a new word. So why don't you lead us into this discussion? What is even an Exvangelical? We all know the term evangelical, and clearly this is a play on that terminology. What does this word mean?
Right. Well, and if you've been with us for a few years, we did, in our fourth season, we did a two-part episode called Exvangelicals, Deconstruction and Deconversion. That was in our fourth season, which I believe was 2021.
2021, yep.
Yes. So I'm sure we talked about that word. At that time, Exvangelical is obviously not a real word. It is, ex as in ex-husband, ex-military.
Yeah,
meaning,
was that your first thought?
It just came to mind. Yeah. No reason. But anyway, ex meaning you've left something or you've finished with something.
Okay, yeah.
And so by exvangelical, that means you no longer identify as an evangelical. So in the book, The Exvangelicals, Sarah McCammon gives a kind of a couple paragraph summary statement that I think is really helpful for setting the stage for what group she's talking about. So she interviews a man named David Gushee. He is an ethicist at Mercer University, and he's an author of the 2020 book, The After Evangelicalism. That's the name of the book.
Okay, so we've got an academic here.
Mm-hmm. Yep, David Gushee. So I'm going to read a quote from the book, The Exvangelicals, that will describe who she's talking about here. Gushee estimates, based on Pew Research Center data from 2014, that even before the rise of the Trump era and all the fallout it brought, some 25 million American adults who had been raised evangelical had left the faith. He points to data showing that the white evangelical church is aging more quickly than the population as a whole, as younger generations of Americans rapidly become less and less religious. And he notes, as documented by polling researcher Daniel Cox in 2018, that about 1/3 of Americans raised in evangelical households leave the tradition as adults.
Wow.
This, Gushee writes, goes well beyond the typical process of adults growing up and charting their own life course, as humans have always done to some extent. Now she's going to quote Gushee. What we are seeing is not just rebellion against parents or normal ebb and flow. We are witnessing conscientious objection, Ex-evangelicals are leaving based on what they believe to be specific offenses against them personally or against their family and friends, and specific experiences of trauma that have left lasting damage. Those experiences, he says, include a host of ills within the evangelical community: clergy sex abuse, bigotry against LGBTQ plus people, hypocritical leaders, and more. So, there he's identifying kind of who is an exvangelical, what are they about?
Yeah, and Bets, what he points out here is in any religious tradition, you're not going to have 100% retention from one generation to the next, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So every generation, Catholic, Jewish, whatever, some percentage of the next generation are going to fall away, are not going to believe that. They're not going to practice that faith.
Right.
But this is way more than normal.
Yes.
This is, there's a leak in the boat, right?
Yes,
It is
that's
flooding.
what the book is arguing.
That is
Yes.
the point of the book. The point of the book is to say, hey, evangelicals, do you realize that you are massively losing the next generation because of these different issues?
Yes.
Is that fair, Beth?
That's fair.
Okay.
I think that's fair.
Okay.
Yep. So going on to talk about the book, this is how it's structured. So the chapters describe different facets or angles of evangelical life that Sarah McCammon, so she was raised as an evangelical. She was raised, it sounds like her family was the kind of family, they were at church all the time. They were listening to James Dobson at home. Like, just when you think of
Christian music.
Yep. She went to a Christian school, kind of all of it. She is, I believe she's in her young 40s. So, that puts her as a child of the 90s, essentially.
Sure.
So that's kind of when this is taking place. So the book examines all these different facets of her evangelical life and upbringing that she thought were normal growing up, but then as she came of age, she started to re-examine them and take an issue with a lot of them. So I'm just going to go through some of them that she brings up as these facets of evangelical life that, again, she thought it was normal growing up. She was like, oh yeah, this is just life. And then as she got older, she was like, really? So what she described as a parallel universe was the first thing that she brought up. And I think the point that she's making is that there was a Christian version for everything in life, right? So there was Christian entertainment, Christian news sources, Christian curriculum for your Christian school, your Christian friends, etc. So she was so
Christian music, Christian movies,
all of it, right?
Everything.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So she was, her the way her family was structured, she was very sheltered, and she, you just hear constantly, the world outside is bad, it's dangerous, it's evil. Unbelievers are bad and dangerous and evil.
So, Bets, if I can just jump in here.
Yeah, of course.
This would be a certain interpretation of the whole, we need to be in the world, but not of the world. Mm-hmm. And according to this interpretation, we reject pretty much all secular institutions.
Yes.
We don't want to have anything to do with them.
Right.
And I guess being in the world means you literally live in the world.
You live on the planet.
You don't live on Mars.
Right.
But other than that, you have all your own stuff.
That's right. And
Yep.
people who are outside of your church bubble are merely people that you need to evangelize. Mm-hmm. Right. And so then as she got older and she started having different experiences, she met lots of unbelievers and she was like, oh, these are wonderful people. They have their own set of beliefs. They have their own ways of making their life make sense. And she couldn't make peace with saying that her way of viewing the world was better as she got older. Mm-hmm. So that was one thing she talked about, the parallel universe. Another thing she talked about was how her evangelical upbringing was very anti-science.
Okay.
So everything that she was raised with came from a very fundamentalist perspective. I'll talk a little bit about my church background as we go on, but I resonated with a lot of what she said.
Yep,
I had a lot of common experiences.
So if I can jump in here, according to how this is traditionally understood, and I'm sure there's variations, so I'm not going to try to lump everybody together, but young Earth creationism tends to
Yes.
say the Earth is like 6,000 years old. And I believe the origin of that number is just adding up the ages
Right.
from the first people in Genesis, and then kind of continuing to add right up to Abraham, and then you from especially from Moses to now is pretty easy. Like we can all agree on that. But it's kind of, okay, what's in the background? And
Right.
you get an Earth that's like 5,000 or 6,000 years old.
And she described, so her grandfather, her dad's dad, was an unbeliever, and she described how he would give them books like National Geographic books or that kind of thing, and I think it was her parents wouldn't let her read them because they came from a different perspective, So this was very.
Yep.
Yeah, this was very heavily emphasized in her home. So another thing was the whole political angle. So she talked about how in the 90s, we remember with President Clinton's indiscretions, so many of the evangelical leaders really railed against him, how his character disqualified him from being president. And she even, she quoted several, I think it was James Dobson and several others. But then fast forward to 2016, and somehow those same people gave Donald Trump, a candidate at the time, gave him a pass. And that was deeply distasteful for her. And I'm going to read a quote that she wrote in the book that I think would be shared, the viewpoint would be shared by a lot of ex-evangelicals. So she said, for many ex-evangelicals, the Trump phenomenon has seemed like a bright light suddenly flicked on in a dark house, exposing every crack in the foundation, every leak, every bit of detritus. So there's another gal that she references that she had interviewed earlier in the chapter. So her name is Enloe Council. Enloe Council said that the January 6th insurrection, where extremist Trump supporters carried crosses and signs bearing the name of Jesus alongside a gallows set up on the Capitol lawn, validated the growing sense of disenchantment she and others had been experiencing for several years. I think it empowered a lot of us to go on the record of where we stand and to kind of point to something and say, look at this. This is the perfect illustration of why we cannot associate with this world anymore, she said. So that was one angle, the whole political angle she
I will tell
examined.
you and I are both children of the 80s and the 90s too. And both of us grew up with a lot of Rush Limbaugh and on in our
Yes, we did.
houses. And I actually used to think that Rush was pretty funny. But I can still remember Rush Limbaugh doing his Bill Clinton impersonation. I did not sleep with that woman, or whatever exactly that he said.
Yes.
And it is true. I think if you grew up in that period, you can remember the church rightly, I would say, saying, hey, this behavior is not becoming of the president.
Right.
And
Yep.
from her perspective is to say, hey, how do we get from there to Trump, President Trump, without seeing an equal
Parallels.
level of scrutiny?
Right.
Some people might say there was that level of scrutiny. Others would say there wasn't.
Yep. So, so the political involvement of the church was one thing that she examined. And then there were several other chapters. There was, she talked a lot about racism in the church. She talked about the treatment of LGBTQ plus people, how she actually found out. So her grandfather, as I said earlier, he was an unbeliever, and her parents really limited the time that she could spend with her grandfather. Well, as she grew up, her parents sat her down and said, well, actually, your grandfather is gay, and he's been living with another man. And so that was one of the reasons that she had been limited in having a relationship with him. And she was so upset by that. And so she talks a lot about the church's treatment of LGBTQ plus people. She also talks about women's roles within the church and the purity culture. The idea that a woman's job is to make sure that men don't sin sexually. I think those of us who grew up in evangelical homes can definitely say, yeah, we heard a lot of that kind of stuff as teens. And she talked also about abortion rights. She talked about abusive discipline that she experienced, coming from spare the rod and spoil the child, and different ways that evangelicals were taught to discipline children. And she talked a lot about fear that she had as a child. So these were all that to say, that's the structure of the book. She went through all these different topics and talked about her experiences as someone raised in an evangelical home. And she talked to a lot of outside voices too. So Josh, does any of this church background, does any of that resonate with your experience?
For sure. Now, I do want to say that when I was around the age of 8 or 9, my parents left a Baptist church and they went to a PCA church. And so I can't remember the Baptist church before we had a PCA church, and that might have leaned more this way. I want to say the PCA church I attended growing up was awesome. The pastor was incredibly faithful to the word and to the gospel. So I don't remember getting any of this from the pulpit or from the church leadership. But did I grow up in the Christian subculture with Christian music and all of that?
Right.
Absolutely, I did. There was a strong emphasis on don't listen to any kind of music other than Christian music.
Right.
That was coming from different areas. I also, a couple things I wrote down. I remember being given the distinct impression that abortion was the only issue that mattered for people when deciding to cast their political vote. And other issues that people might have about drugs or gun control or you name it, some other issue, all of that had to biblically be secondary. A person couldn't say, I am fiercely opposed to abortion, but I'm also have these other big issues that are, and I'm trying to weigh all that when I make my decision on who I vote for. And I will say this, it wasn't the pastor, but I did have a church leader one time, and I can actually still remember this, say to me when I was in high school, Josh, I just think Christians have to be Republicans. Wow. I don't think that I'm not really sure Christians can be Democrats.
Wow.
And I can still, I had to have been 16, 17. It was a church leader that I really respected. And obviously it made an impression on me because I've never forgotten it.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So yeah, there
That's
are
really
some ways that I can relate.
So a lot of times when we read books or interact with different things, it's great to ask the questions, what is there to affirm? Like, where does this resonate, right? What are some areas of disagreements? Where do we go from here? So that's kind of the structure that we're going to take. What is there to affirm, and where does this resonate? So I will say, as someone who very much, I went to a church that sounds, as a child, from about age 3 until I was a junior in high school. So, my very, very formative years at home, I feel like my church experience mirrored Sarah McCammon's church experience in a lot of ways. I understood where she was coming from in a lot of ways. And obviously, spoiler alert, she is no longer a professing Christian, and I wish that she had landed in a different place. But I definitely understand a lot of the issues that she's brought up. So I think we can all say there are a lot of rotten elements in American evangelicalism, right?
Sure.
This
Tons.
made me... I think a lot of our listeners and viewers probably have either listened to or have heard of the podcast Rise and Fall of Mars Hill that came out in 2021. And man, oh man, you can listen to that and get a real in-depth examination of some of those rotten elements.
Yeah, I would say to anybody, if you haven't listened to the podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, which was produced by Christianity Today, go listen to that.
Yeah, it's so
and
good.
You will understand.
And then come back to our podcast.
There you go. Subscribe to both. You will understand where when people see that and say, if that's Christianity, I don't want to have anything to do with that. Like you say, makes total sense.
Yep. So, one thing that she talked about a lot, as I already said, was fear. She lived with a lot of fear that she wasn't really saved, fear that she was going to go to hell, because in her telling of her upbringing, it was so much about the rules, keeping the rules, making sure you followed them, making sure you had confessed all your sins before you went to bed at night. So much fear. And fear just doesn't bring people to Jesus in meaningful ways, and that's So one thing she talked about in the book is this movie. I should have written down the year. It's called A Thief in the Night. I wonder if anyone listening or watching has seen it. It came out in the 1970s. So it's basically a very low budget movie about the rapture and end times. And I watched this movie. I went to a Christian school, elementary school. I watched this movie in my Bible class it was probably fifth grade, I bet. So I was 10 or 11. I'm guessing it was around fifth grade. I was so terrified, I could not sleep for days because it's about this girl. She hears the gospel. She doesn't accept Christ. And one day she wakes up and all of her friends are gone. And then people come in and try to put the mark of the beast on her, and she's arrested. And then there's a follow-up movie that I also watched as a little kid. And there's a guillotine in the movie.
You said there were decapitations?
Yeah. Yo, this was terrifying, like literally terrifying. And so what I'm saying is, did that teach me about the love of Christ in a meaningful way? No, I was just terrified.
You don't want to get your head cut off after the rapture.
Right, exactly. So it's like that kind of stuff that Sarah McCammon actually mentioned that movie. And I could remember very vividly watching that and being literally terrified. So I very much resonated with her description of that. And then I think we all can see that there are many churches that are practicing a version of syncretism. And isn't it funny when you know what a word means, but you can't really articulate it?
Sure.
So I know I can use the word syncretism and I know what I mean, but I had to Google the actual definition. This is what it means: the blending of different belief systems, practices, or ideas. So as she pointed out, there are many churches in American evangelicalism that are practicing Jesus plus politics. And I read another book last year. It was called The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory by Tim Alberta. I may have mentioned it in a different episode. But that book exposes a lot of this pattern in the American evangelical church. And I just wanted to read one quote from that book that was very provocative. So he is talking about Christian leaders who are convinced that, we all need to be on the offense for our faith in a really explicit way. So this is what he says. He says, simply put, Trump created a new moral political framework in which people like Charlie Kirk and Eric Metaxas and John Zmirak, if you don't know those names, they're in the political sphere, but also, are believers. So these guys convince evangelicals to distrust any believer who dares stray from their absolutist ideology. They do so by fomenting fears of a crushing, coordinated assault on Christianity and by attacking anyone who refuses to adopt a militant posture in response. This is how Metaxas justifies portraying Tim Keller, the widely admired New York theologian, and Rick Warren, the author and leader of Saddleback Church in California, as Hitler's favorite kind of pastors. This is how John Zmirak gets away with likening David French, our friend David from this podcast, a staunch defender of social conservatism and of religious liberty, to Nazi collaborators. This is how Tucker Carlson blasts Russell Moore and his aforementioned friends as cowards who don't have the guts to defend their faith against a secular onslaught. So, all that to say, Sarah McCammon is pointing out that there is a lot of mixture in the evangelical church of Jesus with a certain type of politics.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And a phrase that we've heard used recently before, I think we did this show 3.5 years ago on Exvangelicals. Now we have this phrase, Christian nationalism, which I think is a useful phrase. And we should remember that this is not a left or right thing, because there have been periods where the church, and I'm sure this is true in every country, every civilization, the church gets yoked to the left side of the political aisle, or the church gets yoked to the right side of the political aisle. And in the past, we've had the social gospel, where the church Christianity became how much good can we do for others, but it got pulled away from orthodox doctrine, the person of Christ, the authority of the Bible, all this stuff. But now we're seeing Christian nationalism arise in certain parts of American Christianity, which does seem to have baptized the agenda of the far right with Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, so those were some interesting parts that I think you could say, wow, that's thought-provoking. She's got some real good points there. And then there are, of course, ways that I had disagreements with her. I think one thing that I would say to Sarah McCammon or to anyone who identifies as an exvangelical, it feels a little bit like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Because, and this is what I mean by that, American evangelicalism, it's such a narrow expression of Christianity, right? Like Christianity is a big tent. It spans centuries. It spans culture. It spans all kinds of expression. And so American evangelicalism is just a little blip on the radar. So instead of examining other expressions of Christianity, I feel like the Exvangelicals are assuming that's all there is and you walk away from everything, right? So she gave a really interesting quote from Jemar Tisby, who's written several notable books. He says this, and I thought this was really interesting. I think, this is Jemar Tisby she's quoting, I think there are a lot of people who call themselves Exvangelicals who have also erased the black church. Because what they're essentially saying is the only way to be a Christian is the way white evangelicals have been Christians. And I don't want any part of that without ever deeply considering black Christians. Jemar Tisby is a black man. And what he's getting at there, I really appreciate, because what he's saying is the Exvangelicals are saying, as he said, the only way to be Christian is the way white evangelicals have been Christians. So it's a very narrow consideration. Yeah. And what if evangelicalism has elements that have been warped and distorted? But you're not considering that.
Yeah, it's a straw man to say that Christianity is American evangelicalism over, say, the last 40 years. I mean, that's a straw man. It's incredibly intellectually lazy as well to just say, well, that's Christianity, therefore I'm not going to have anything to do with Christianity. Now, a person may reject Christianity for a lot of reasons.
That's right.
But to say that you're going to reject it simply because of this one expression, and what I would say is the deformation, is that a word? I don't know.
Yeah. Deformity?
The deformity of what the movement was for a long time is worse. Now, I don't know when the place we're going to get here for, but I have some suggestions and some hopes for the American Evangelical Church.
Oh, good.
And you tell me, Bets, when you want me to share those.
Oh, that's coming.
But I am ready to give up on the word evangelical. I don't need the word.
Sure.
That does not, if I lose that word, nothing gets hurt in my faith. Mm-hmm. But yeah, to say that, well, because of, what I'm seeing in the American megachurch, which is a lot of American megachurches do fit this. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
Sure.
Well, if that's what Christianity is, I don't have anything to do with that. Well, I mean, come on, that's not Christianity.
Right.
It's one tiny little expression.
That's right. Yeah, and another disagreement or thing that, this book made me think of is the tradition and the upbringing that she describes. It's just so legalistic. There's so much focus on the rules, the fear, the shame, who's in and who's out. And that's not the heart of the Christian faith if you read the Bible. Like, God gives commands for our protection, but what he's after is a relationship. And there was so little of that language in Sarah McCammon's description of her background, her understanding of Christianity. It just made me sad because so much of it was focused on, am I keeping the rules? Am I breaking the rules? That's a bad person. This is a good person. And that's just not the heart of Christianity. So I think it's fine to be an exvangelical because evangelical doesn't equal Christian necessarily. I mean, those two terms are not,
Yeah. I mean, if you want to walk away from the evangelical church, especially if you're walking away from the distortion, hey, that's good. We got no issue with that.
No.
It is sad to see people leave Christianity.
That's right.
Period. And again, I have some suggestions and some hopes
Yes.
for how things might turn around a little bit.
Well, let's hear some of those. I mean, so yeah, at this point, I like to ask, okay, so she's described this problem in her book. We've kind of talked about some of the good things, some of the not as good things. Where do we go from here? What do you think?
Yeah, well, the first thing is, let's remember that these words they have moments in history. Okay, people have not called themselves evangelical for 2,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like the apostles were walking around saying, hey, we're evangelicals.
Right.
The Bible says that the first disciples, there was ways in the Bible that we didn't even use. They said we're followers of the way. No one talks that way anymore. But that's actually in the Bible. We're Jesus followers. We're Christians. We're little Christ through the power of the gospel to change us. If we lose that word, that's okay. I actually think it would probably come back at some point, because evangelical comes from the Greek word euangelion, which means the good news. So it's simply been a description to say that evangelicals are Christians who are centered on the gospel, centered on Jesus. That's what the movement was under Billy Graham, I think, for the most part. If we ever had a leader, it was Billy Graham. Is the movement fracturing some? Yes, I think there's no question about that. But to me, I'm not worried about losing the word evangelical, Bets, and here's why. More and more, the way I find myself describing myself is as an Orthodox Protestant. Orthodox, meaning I believe in the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, the Orthodox understanding of doctrine, and I'm a Protestant. I come out of the Reformation, Martin Luther, John Calvin. I'm an Orthodox Protestant. And the word Protestant, in my opinion, has way less political baggage than the word evangelical does. I like as well that it pushes me back to the Reformation and to the truths that were reclaimed at the Reformation. And I would even say this. I also think that, and if any of our audience, any of our viewers or listeners is looking for a church, what I want to say to you is, I would really hope and pray that we see denominations become stronger in the next coming decades. Because the issue with the American evangelicalism is so many of them are these churches that have no accountability, they have no structure, they're basically all their own little movement, and they're all led by these celebrities. And the denomination that we're a part of a wonderful denomination, the Presbyterian Church in America. I would tell any of our audience, you're looking for a good church, find a PCA church around you. The PCA is not the only denomination that I would recommend. There's other great ones. But I would love to see people gain an appreciation again for denominations where there is collective accountability, collective identity that's not celebrity driven, and that can help define us. And so instead of just falling back on this evangelical label and saying, well, who even gets to define what that means?
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about is how important it is for us who are believers just to listen to people's stories and experiences and not to be defensive, but just to love people where they are and to try to understand where they're coming from. And don't cut off relationships with people because you don't agree. She described at many points in the book how for her, as someone who was losing touch with her faith, one thing that really was terrifying for her was being cut off from her community, losing her sense of identity. She said several times she just felt like she was flailing without any kind of direction. And she talked about how many people who are identifying as evangelicals have been cut off by people they love because they don't agree with them.
Yeah,
let's
that's so
not
sad.
Let's
Why
not
would
be
we do
people
that?
who cut people off.
No.
We can be a safe place for people to share their stories and to ask questions. It's okay.
Yeah, and I'd also add, if anybody's watching, listening, you've deconstructed in your faith. Look, your life is a journey. Your life is a story. You can reconstruct your faith.
Sure.
You can rebuild your faith. And honestly, if your faith was built on a really shallow foundation, it was never really built on the true gospel, the true Evangelion, then it's good that that foundation is eradicated so that you can then build it on the real foundation. So this movement of people walking away from the church, it doesn't have to all be bad. Of course, it does grieve my heart when people talk about hashtag church hurt and they see the scandals and they say church too, and they say, if that's what it is, I don't want to have anything to do with it, because God really didn't make us to live the Christian life by ourselves. You know, some are leaving the church, but not Jesus. But that's full of all kinds of problems too. Other people are walking away from everything.
Yep.
But I would just so encourage anybody, if you know somebody, if you're praying for anybody like that, to just remember their story's not done, and that there are wonderful stories of people who reconstruct. And when you reconstruct, you tend to come back so much stronger than you were before.
Yep. And also just a reminder that God can handle our questions. You know, it's okay. It's okay to ask those really hard questions, to look for answers for the really hard questions. God can handle it.
He can.
And also what's encouraging to me is there are so many smart believers who have written extensively about these difficult questions. There's a lot out there that you can dig into if you know you're struggling with your faith, if you're looking for answers. There's a lot out there. And so God can handle it. It's okay.
He can, and dig into the Word. Find who God is through His Word, and not from
that's right
all the stereotypes and things that you hear.
Yeah.
So
and in closing, you know, in our Bible study here at church, we are going through the book of Luke, and this past week has been especially meaningful because we studied Luke 15, which is the parable of the prodigal son. And what's just so beautiful and really struck me as I was thinking about preparing for this episode was, you know, Jesus in that parable, he shares the heart of the Father. The Father is the one who pursues sinners. He seeks and saves the lost. You know, he's not the one who is standing there saying, well, if you had kept the rules better, you know, it would be okay. He's the Father who goes out to seek and to save the lost. And that's really the heart of God, and it's so beautiful. And so I just want to encourage anyone who's listening, whether you're struggling with your faith yourself or you know other people, that is really, truly the heart of God, and it's a beautiful thing.
Amen. Amen. And to Sarah McCammon or anybody like her, the message is, you don't need to come back to the evangelical church as you understand it.
That's right.
We'd love it if you came back to Jesus and to His bride as He sees it, and not as the world sees it.
Yep.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. We hope that you will tune in next time or listen next time if you're on the podcast app. And remember to subscribe and give us some love if you don't mind.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.